Thank you for inviting me to the Origin Scholars Speaker Series. I'd like to say that this will be a brief and non-technical introduction to some of the material that's covered in a book called The Origin of Ideas that will be published by Oxford University Press in 2014. And if you have questions that go unanswered and queries that you would like to have satisfied, you can go to my website, markturner.org, and you will find other videos and other introductions and little abstracts for you to follow. Now, for all of the origin sciences, the topic of tonight's talk is probably the one with which we human beings are most familiar, because we are the origin of ideas. We are not the origin of galaxies, or of life, or of the covalent bond or DNA, or of immune systems, or of black holes. But what we are the origin of, many, many ideas that arise very quickly, on the fly, all the time in human minds, sometimes tumbling out and influencing other people. With these new ideas that we make so easily in our species, we have new understanding of the world, new understanding of each other. And when we have a newer idea and we share it with someone, they can use it to build yet a newer idea. And we can have a newer idea on top of a newer idea on top of a newer idea on top of a newer idea. We can have ideas that our ancestors 10,000 years ago did not have. We know this. And in fact, the pace with which the cultural evolution of ideas moves makes biological evolution look as if it's standing still or going backward sometimes. We all know that some of the ideas we have are much better in some circumstances than some of the instincts we have, however powerfully they remain with us. Now, these new ideas are not instincts themselves. They're not like a beaver's instinct for building a dam, or a bee's instinct for doing a waggle dance, or a bat's instinct for echolocating and ingesting an insect, sorry. Not like echolocating and ingesting an insect. But, and we have those instincts. We have plenty of instincts. Other animals do lots of things we can't. But we can do some things that are far beyond their rudimentary capacities. And the origin of ideas is the top one. We can have ideas that our parents did not have. We can have, every child knows that, right? We can have ideas that even we did not have yesterday, right? Now, how can this have happened? Where do new ideas come from? The universe 200,000 years ago seemed to be doing just fine. All that flora, all that fauna, all those species. They didn't need to be able to do this. It's not as if evolution was on a march to get to this point. This is a strange phenomenon in the world. Well, 50,000 years ago, more or less, depending on what we find in the archaeological record, we begin to see evidence of an extremely impressive range of human singularities. Art, music, science, mathematical insight, dance, fashion, representation, painting, sculpture, the use of decorative dress to indicate social status. All these kinds of things that are so utterly common to us now that we take for granted. It might be that the archaeological record will push the evidence for some of this fabulous creativity back, maybe as far back as Blombos Cave or Border Cave in South Africa, right? But that would still push it back to like 55, 70, maybe 80. These are really tiny ranges of time. They're just an eye blink in evolution. Very, very small amount of time. To give you an idea of the range we're talking about, depending on what you read and what you look at, the split in the lines that produced Pan-troglodytes and Pan-peniscus, the chimpanzees and bonobos, and us, Homo, maybe about 5.5 million years ago. Anatomically modern human beings, that is, people who look like us, that if you saw them their gross anatomy would look like ours. It's about 150,000 years ago. But the range of archaeological evidence that I'm talking about is only about 50,000 years ago. It's very, very tiny. Not that there wasn't a long run-up of bifacial stone tools and Oldowan tool sets and Acheulean tool sets. But here, let me try to give a sense of the great difference I'm talking about. Here's a tool set that was used in the hominid or hominoid line. It lasted species-wide about 800,000 years. Now, when I say a tool set, although these things are very impressive, I mean, you know, a rock that gets split and used in a couple of ways, right? Now, this lasted without much variation, without much improvement or updating for 800,000 years. So I want everybody to get the point. I want you to say 800,000 years. Go. 800,000 years. Good. Most of the things you care about were invented in the last 2. You know, schools or 4, right? Law, art, writing, English, a few hundred years old, right? 800,000 years. Now, if you gave that tool set to a child today, the child would come up with something new to do with it in 15 minutes, right? This thing just didn't change. We're very impressed with the bits of culture that were put together early on. But the pace of invention is so slow as to be unimaginable to a cognitively modern human being. There's something about the way we think. We take it for granted. We think it's utterly easy, but not so much. To give you an example, here's the Lion Man. The Lion Man is a 32,000-year-old ivory figurine. It's found in 1938. It was a bunch of shards. Nobody knew what to do with it. When it was reassembled in 1998, scientists began to make proposals that this was a sign of a major evolutionary step that made us creative. The idea is that working memory expanded. Working memory is what you can hold and work on simultaneously in mind. And so the idea went, now you could hold on to lion and man at the same time and work on them. Well, that may be true. And in fact, I'm very grateful for it because it means we can get modern songs.
In the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight.
See, if you weren't cognitively modern, you couldn't be entertained by a song like that. You couldn't even follow it. The idea was here that you could hold lion and man in mind at the same time, and indeed you can. And it may well have been that expansion of working memory really did something for us. But look, the thing you notice most here is not that this is a lion and a man. Presumably, your idea of a lion eating a man or a lion killing a man also holds lion and man in mind at the same time. Here, the lion and the man are blended. It's not a lion and a man, it's a lion man. And this is going to be what I'm going to talk about, taking two ideas that should not go together. A lion is not a man is not a lion. You should not confuse them. You could die. And putting together lion and man, by the way, this might be a woman or just a human, nobody's really sure, putting them together to create something that's not just a cut and paste. This has parts of lion and parts of man, but it also prompts us for a conception of a new being that might have capabilities that are not shared by lions, not shared by men. Certainly, one new idea here is this thing might speak, right? Lions don't speak. The lion man might. Again, to impress upon you the time scale, I'd like to point out that prior to the Upper Paleolithic, which you're going to be hearing about next week from Patricia Princehouse and the cave paintings, prior to 32, 42, 52,000 years ago, there is no representational art. There are no faces. There are no petroglyphs. None. Now, every child can look at the sky and see faces in the cloud. Do it all the time. All over the world, people are sitting on their haunches, sketching figures with a stick, right? You have seen two indentations in a rock that look like eyes, right? Go back 100,000 years ago with me in the time machine and ask yourself, why did not Thug, one of our ancestors, sketch a little smile under those two eyes? Would have been the simplest thing in the world. The tools necessary for it, these old Owen tools, go back 2.6 million years, right? And in fact, just a sharp rock would have worked. All over the world, people put together material anchors like stone or the cloud, and what they want to represent and collapse them. They put them together. They put the cloud and the face. They put the stone and the face. They blend them together. That, we just don't have any archaeological evidence of that having been done. There's some scratches on bones and things like that. But before 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, just didn't happen, or so it doesn't seem. That's the question. This may be the biggest question, open question, that science faces. What was the human spark? How did our species get it? What did it consist of? And why does every child have it now? And what I'm going to discuss tonight is the concept of advanced blending, putting different things together into a new idea, new ideas out of old. Other species seem to have some very rudimentary abilities to do this. So we're not talking at all about human beings coming up with evolutionarily or being endowed with something evolutionarily that's completely new. No, it's just a run-up on the gradient of being able to put together ideas. Moreover, this is certainly not, emphatically not, a suggestion that blending is everything. On the contrary, for blending, advanced blending to work, all the other stuff had to be there. All of the biology, attention, perception, various kinds of time, space, collocation, and so on. But sometimes a little difference makes all the difference. Once we got advanced blending, it seems that this capacity could then, like an extra drop in the top of the bathtub that makes not just one drop spill over, but lots and lots and lots of water spill over because you went past the tipping point. Running up just a little bit on this gradient seems to have been a kind of tipping point. It's not that it's doing it all by itself, but it produces a vast range of these human singularities: art, music, mathematics and science, advanced social cognition, sign systems, fashions of dress, language, and so on. So before we have the question and answer break, I'll give you one little example. My brother-in-law and his family came here to visit for Thanksgiving. And I said, wow, we'll have to go pick them up at the airport. Now, I'm holding lots of ideas in mind. Brother-in-law, relationships, Thanksgiving feast. But at one point, somebody said, if you were your brother-in-law, you'd be miserable. And what they meant was, my brother-in-law is a stockbroker. And the stock market opens at 6:30 in the morning, Pacific time. And when I see 6:30 in the morning, it's because I've stayed up all night, right? He has to arise at 5 o'clock in the morning if he's going to be able to do his work. So I don't do that. Now, there's a new element in the blend. It is not I, and it is not my brother-in-law. It has my capacities and dispositions, but it has his job. It has his location in San Francisco. And notice something. This entity in the blend, this new idea, is miserable. He's not miserable. I'm not miserable, but the new idea is miserable. Now, the rest of the talk is not about how we become miserable, but it will be about blending.
So you would say that we don't think linearly?
We certainly have lots and lots of capacities. And one of the things that consciousness is good for is keeping us on task long enough to learn something and keeping focus. So, It's often the case when I do my taxes a couple days ago, or when I have to account for the money in the bank account or give grades to students. I may have a linear system of thinking, that kind of an accounting system that I'm sort of constraining myself to use, right? And we all like those sorts of things, right? And cultures invent them, and they give them to you, right? But even then, the question is, how did an accounting system get invented? How did balancing your checkbook get invented? How did a bank, where here's your statement, and that's what you think is over there, and what's on the statement, you know, if you make a change in the statement that clarifies for you what's going on over there, that kind of linear ability still took, that kind of linear performance, cultural performance that we're trained in, still took a process of invention.
You refer to that every child has this spark. But the question more is, how does the child keep it in view of the education system? That seems to knock out the spark. And creative children are looked upon as Ritalin specimens rather than value to our system.
That is an excellent question, and I consult with a number of educational firms and professors on how to alter systems so as to feed creativity and inspiration. To give you an example, mathematics is extremely important and powerful in our society. We use it for all kinds of things. And it's clearly an invented system. One of the directors of the Fields Institute network on the cognitive science of mathematics. And we often talk about the origin of mathematical ideas. But here's one of the problems. There are several stages in the learning of mathematics where you just seem to lose 95% of your group. So learning fractions. When a culture has to dedicate all of third grade to trying to teach you something, you know that this is running against a problem. Being able to factor, think algebraically, being able to think about dynamic systems, and all the way up. By the time you get to a professional mathematician who can actually be inventive and come up with a new mathematical idea, you're talking about a 20th of a 20th of a 20th of a 20th of a 20th. Now, how do you free that up? And what I would say is that the one thing we're doing in mathematics education and physics education and chemistry education is recognizing the downsides, the bad consequences of certain kinds of blends. So for instance, I've got a certain kind of blend of how the world works. It's called naive physics. And if I try to understand relativistic quantum mechanics using my naive physics, it's not that I'm a blank slate and I can just step into that. No, I have deep down these blends that I've learned that work very well, but we have to pull them out by the roots. We have to deracinate the old ones in order to make room for the new ones. So we don't have answers on this. This research on blending it was launched about 20 years ago by Gilles Fauconnier, cognitive science at UCSD, and me. And we have, in the last 4 or 5 years, started to consult with educational enterprises in the hope of addressing some of just the questions you raised. Second tranche. Now, to recoup, let's look at this brother-in-law that I'm not, right? Notice, by the way, it's a bad idea to put me together with my brother-in-law. I am not my brother-in-law. It would be a mistake to be confused about this. I'm not actually confused. Notice that there are only some things. I'm the little yellow circle up there. My brother-in-law is the red circle. And in the green circle, it's just my little diagram, the blend, there's a new person. There's a new idea who has new features, is miserable. New stuff. That's a new idea. But notice how selective the projection is. So for instance, in the blend, when I am my brother-in-law, I do not have the family relationships that my brother-in-law has. Because if I did, I'd have to be my own brother-in-law, and that's taboo. We don't do that in our culture, right? Very slight projections and emergent structure once you get these things together. So let's look at a few of these. There's a little cognitive science. So you can think about something. You can hold something in focus. It's amazing that you can also think of something else at the same time. You all do this. You remember something. You think of where you're going to be tomorrow. This is already a major cognitive scientific problem, because as Glenberg writes in 1997, why doesn't this lead to hallucination? You would think that what you can call to mind would be subordinated to the present environment. This is what I have to operate in, right? Suppose I suddenly have a memory of myself surfing in Del Mar, San Diego, right? That's not going to serve me very well right here. I need the motor patterns for standing up here, not on a wave. And let me tell you, they are very different. So I better not get confused. Why am I able to call these kinds of things up? This already takes an evolutionary account. Glenberg gives one, and Terry Deacon has been working on why this can happen now for about 15 years. He has a theory of self-domestication that we could go into, if you like. But we can do more than that. We can connect them. We can say, well, there's a kind of understanding of a person who's married and has a job, and it applies to me and to my brother-in-law. So there's a connection there, a frame connection, a mental concept connection. There's another connection, which is a connection of relation. This is not an identity connection. I am not my brother-in-law. But we can project from those connections to a new space. We fuse those two things, not completely, only partially, and we get a new thing in the blend. I am my brother-in-law, and I'm miserable. Good thing I'm not. So let's do this again. Suppose, as I once witnessed, acquaintance of mine, suppose there's somebody who's a groomsman at a wedding, and he's helping, he's escorting people and so on. But he's thinking about the fact that 3 weeks ago he was diving with his girlfriend off Cabo San Lucas looking for buried treasure, right? Now notice, in one space he's breathing air, in the other space he's down under the water, right? He doesn't get confused. He still walks down the aisle. He still talks normally, although in the diving space he can't. He does not mistake the bride for a shark, right? It's a good thing, right? But he can do more than that. He can start to make a connection between, say, the bride and his girlfriend. Again, this is a frame connection. There's a romantic relationship in each of them. Here's the bride, here's the girlfriend. And he can do more, as he did. He started to imagine, while he's watching this wedding overlooking the Pacific Ocean, he started to daydream about marrying his girlfriend. Now notice, what comes down from the wedding is this wedding and the roles and the position. And what comes down from the diving is the girlfriend. She's not here at the wedding, right? But now we have put together things that don't go together. They don't belong in the same memory space. And he starts to run the tape. And interestingly, when the officiant gets to the point, do you now take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? He's freaking out. And the reason he's freaking out is in his simulation, she's not happy. This isn't working. Now, for the real bride, it's working great. But in his blend, it's not working. In fact, she's about to say no. I wouldn't take you for the last man on earth. And he begins to think that maybe he's misunderstood the relationship. Now, we do this all the time. We make blends of things that can give us a new idea that we then want to accomplish. So we make a plan to accomplish it. Or we can see something that we hadn't seen before. So we remember something from childhood, but we've just seen this event. We put them together, and now you know why your uncle said that to your aunt. You didn't know that before, but now you know because you're able to put these different things together. Those are pyrotechnic examples. Let's look at an everyday example. Now, when you think of your experience, there's one day and then another day and 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 another day. It just goes on like that, right? Other species seem to be able, instincts, evolution can put together behavior that has long-range consequences, like flying someplace to mate. But holding on to vast registers of time and space and causation and agency is very challenging for other species, actually manipulating it mentally as opposed to having been conditioned for a task or relying on an instinct. We, however, can think about ancient Athens. We can think about the 300 Years' War. We can think about what will happen after the sequester. We can think about what's going to happen to Europe. We're able to hold vast expanses of time in mind. Now, it's not that our working memory is that big. What we have to do in order to think at that scope is blend to make a small little compression that's at human scale. This is what we do with a day. We blend all the days together and they become one day, the cyclic day. And now we can say things that are not true, like midnight will come round again. If you think about it, midnight never comes round again. No day ever starts again. If it did, you'd be freaked out. Even in the movie Groundhog Day, the only thing that is the same as the previous day is the little radio announcer in the morning, and then it all changes, right? We have the idea of a cyclic day. It's one day. We can hold it in mind, and we can use that day to think of a day in ancient antiquity. We can use it to think of these 3 or 4 or 5 days here. But we only have to carry this one little compressed blend. And we can say amazing things like, I didn't have my morning coffee. Now, what's my morning coffee? It means that in the cyclic day, no day ever starts over. No day ever comes round again, but it does in our mind. That's what I mean by this being an everyday blend that cultures have given you. And by the way, if you think calendars and these kinds of cycles of time are normal, just look into the history of how long it took to come up with them and what fights there were over which were the best ones, right? We can say, I didn't have my morning coffee, so my morning coffee is in the cyclic day even if I didn't have it. We can say this park closes at dusk. And you know that in the cyclic day, there's a spot where the park closes. And so you don't have to say, well, when does it close this day? 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 No, it's in the cyclic day. And you can map that cyclic day. You can expand it to any particular day. And then you are able to operate at a scale that you otherwise would not be able to operate. This is a very common way of putting different ideas together. You take the similarities or analogies between them, so the days are analogous. And you take what's different about them, and you squeeze all of the things that are analogous or similar into one thing. So now you have the day. All the days have a certain kind of order. So now you bring that down to one day. And then the things that are different about them come down to change. And the one thing changes. In this case, the change is a new idea. It cycles around. If that seems obvious to you, go try to teach that to a ring-tailed lemur, right? If that seems obvious to you, it's because you're a cognitively modern human being. Blending is not expensive. Blending is not costly. It's what your brain is built for. So here's an example that'll show you some of this kind of blending. When the New York Times wanted to convey to you how impressive it was that Hikam el-Garouche broke the record in the mile, what they did is put a little diagram at the top of the news article in which they took the fastest milers from the previous 5 decades, and they put them on the track where they would have been if they had run at a constant speed when Hikam el-Garouche crossed the finish line. Now notice, none of these people ever raced against each other, right? Some of them were not alive at the same time. But you've got 6 different spaces, and in every one of those mental spaces, there's a mile, and there are runners on it. You fuse all the different mile tracks to one. Instead of bringing down all the runners, you just bring down the winners. In fact, the record holders. And notice the great emergent structure. Now, all of those other 5 guys were not just winners in their individual ideas. They were world record holders. But now down in the mythic race in which they're running against each other and Hikam el-Garouche, they become losers, right? They go from winners to losers. This is an idea that's easy for us to hold on to because it's compressed. Now, we're not deluded. When we say Hikam El-Garouche defeated Roger Bannister by 120 yards. Roger Bannister ran in the 50s. We don't actually think that they ran against each other, but they run against each other in the blend. And you understand what that means for the network. So the blend helps you hold on to a network. So here's a riddle, and that'll be the end of our second bit. This is to show you an obvious way in which blending can help you solve things, come up with new ideas. There's a riddle of the Buddhist monk. A Buddhist monk begins at dawn one day, walking up a mountain, reaches the top at sunset, meditates at the top overnight until at the next dawn, he begins to walk back to the foot of the mountain, which he reaches at sunset. Okay, so he starts here, walks up, sunset, sits down overnight, stands up, walks back down, reaches it at dawn. Riddle. Is there a spot on the path that the monk must occupy at the same hour of the day on the 2 successive days? People find this very hard. Lots of tests have been run on this since 1954. Carl Dunker's been running tests on this. Many mathematicians get it wrong. I know. They frequently say, that's the fixed point theorem. It isn't. It's the intermediate value theorem, but it is. But here's an easy way to solve it. Just take the journey of the monk. He goes up, he sits down, he gets up, he goes down. Now I made this. All I have done here is take the 2 journeys and superimpose them. Yes. There is a spot where he meets. There is a spot that he must occupy at the same hour of the day on the 2 successive days because he has to meet himself. Where he meets himself is obviously the same spot on the path, and because of the way you've projected to the blend, it's the same time. You don't know where that spot is, but you know he has to meet himself as long as he doesn't leave the path, as long as they start at one end of the path and at dawn, and they go to the other end of the path by sunset. Doesn't matter how they do it, they have to cross somewhere, right? Now, I can prove this for you graphically and mathematically, but all of the graphical and algebraic proofs are also blends of exactly this sort. So what's happening here? There are a couple different input spaces. There's the ascent and the descent. You make a mapping between them. So there's the path and the path. There's the monk and the monk. You project parts of these things to a blend. So notice the 2 paths come in and are fused into one path. But the 2 monks, who are identical, come in as separate monks, right? There's variation in this. And notice some things you don't project. You don't say, oh no, he never meets himself, because if you're going up the hill and you saw yourself coming at yourself, you'd freak out and run in the opposite direction. You don't project his psychology, right? And his perception into the blend in just that sort of way. And the result is there's emergent structure in the blend. There's a meeting. Now, we're not deluded. We don't think the monk actually met himself. But if I say, oh yes, there is such a spot, the spot is where the monk meets himself, then the language refers to the blend, and you know how to pack back out from the blend to the network, and it solves the riddle for you. So here's an overall representation of this example of blending 2 things you shouldn't be confused about. You shouldn't put them together. You blend the ascent and the descent, and it makes a pop-out new idea that solves the problem for you and makes it possible for you to deliver answers to things that otherwise would be too hard to hold on to.
You talk about increases in the size of the working memory. Can you quantify that?
I can't, but this was covered elaborately in Science magazine. And I can give you the sites. In fact, the sites are on that slide. And they made some estimates, but it's very, very hard because you understand brains don't survive, right, from 32,000 years ago. We have no evidence of what's going on inside the brain. We may know that people looked anatomically modern, but we don't know what the wiring in their brain was like. And that's plastic anyway. There are endocasts. That is, you can look at the inside of a skull and get a little bit of an idea, maybe what kind of indentations were there, and so on. So not having a time machine, there's no way to go back and like run behavioral tests and see how many numbers people can hold in mind. There's this in-back test, for instance. You say a string of numbers to somebody and you want them to repeat back the third one ago that you said, right? So you see how much they can hold in memory. We can't do that. We don't have a TARDIS. We can't go back in time and run these tests. So the proposals about an expansion in working memory have just been a matter of qualitative hypothesis so far. One of the problems working on human beings.
Does anyone try to validate this idea by looking at people who have suffered some degree of memory loss?
Of course. In the cognitive sciences and psychology, we work with people who have either congenital or adventitious differences from what are often called neurotypicals in order to do comparative work. So for instance, one of the things that you will frequently find is that people on the autism spectrum, something we don't understand well, it's kind of a mosaic, people are working on it, at the high end very frequently have spectacular abilities to blend ideas, to put together two different ideas for representation, for instance. Often very spectacular, but are sometimes quite challenged at the blend you need to make another mind. So for instance, you and I are looking at each other and it seems as if we can read each other's minds. But of course, there is no direct access to somebody else's mind at all. At all. It's all completely indirect. We're built for this. In order to do this, you have to project to me, or to a blend for me, something you know only from yourself, which is mindedness. When you look that way, it's because you noticed something. When you back up from something, it's because you had some kind of mental event. So seeing these appearances, you create for me a kind of mindedness, which is a blend of you and me, right? And then you have to kind of adjust this. And the challenge for folks children with Asperger condition, for example, some high-functioning autism, is not so much that they can't make the blend. They do understand at the high end that there's another person there. It's just they project too much from themselves. They think you understand what they understand. They think you're completely interested in what they are interested in. And so they make a mind for you that's sort of less supple in some ways. But this pattern of taking people who have, as I say, congenital or adventitious deficits or conditions is something we kind of look at all the time. I just want to say, when I mentioned at the beginning that the fact that that blending does some good things for you doesn't mean it's doing them. On the contrary, it's sitting on top of a great range of evolved mental abilities. But still, as people are putting together these just so stories about how maybe evolution worked, it's not uncommon, for instance, to encounter the speculation that in fact blending and various kinds of memory could have worked together. So if, for instance, if you can do some kind of blending, then it becomes fitter to be able to have a bigger working memory, because now you can hold more things in mind. And if you have a bigger working memory, then being able to blend the things that you're putting together in working memory is yet fitter. So these are all these evolutionary sort of bootstrap notions of the way in which mental abilities might feed each other. It would also be the case for long-term memory. So here's a point. If you're driven by the present environment, then what's in it is coherent. It hangs together. But some of what you want to blend together doesn't go together, right? So you need to be able to call into mind things that don't fit this environment, right? Well, if they don't fit this environment, then they're not in this environment. So if you have long-term memory that can remind you of that time you were in Spain, or that time you were underwater, or that time when you were eating paella, all those things I'm not doing now, then your blending machinery has more to work with. So a better long-term memory that can serve up things to you that the present cannot serve to you could have been helpful in serving blending. And then again, the better you could blend these things, the more reason there would be to have these kinds of long-term memories. Now, as we just mentioned in the question and answer, one of the things that human beings are spectacularly good at is advanced social cognition, having an idea of another mind that's not just a goal-driven agent, but that has ideology and beliefs and perspectives and viewpoints and beliefs that are false, right? Now, this is a level of understanding of other minds at which we really, really excel. Children are very, very good at it. But in order to do that, you have to be able to put together some sense of your own mindedness with the appearances and actions that you're seeing. Remember, although it seems as if you can understand somebody else's mind and look right into it, there is no direct access to any other mind. There are just all these indirect things like brain imaging and simulation and behavior that we try to that we try to use as ways to get in. So this was actually understood as long ago as 18th century. Adam Smith, in Theory of the Moral Sentiments, says, we have no immediate experience of what other men feel. We can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in like situation. We take their conditions, our mindedness, blend them together, boom. Now, in the blend, there's a person over there that's having certain kinds of thoughts. And he's quite elaborate about this. It goes on for chapters on this kind of blending for other people. He points out, for example, that we sympathize with the dead. And we form a mind for the dead. We think how terrible it is to be buried under the ground in these kinds of conditions, when of course we know perfectly well that those conditions are not felt by the corpse in the grave. So he explores a great range of human culture and the creation of other minds, not just for conspecifics, but for trees, for houses, for the dead, right? This blending of self and the other object. You know, talking animals, stuffed toys are the mainstay of the nursery. So here's an example of putting together one of these strange ones. There's a quasi-agent called the decedent. It's a concept in law, very important. So we can have documents like a will that seem to give us some evidence of the intentions that somebody might have had before. But they're not here, right? They're not here. But you can blend the person with the documents and you get a decedent. Now, the decedent is not a full person. A, the decedent is not here. B, the decedent cannot answer questions. But still, we can think of the decedent as a quasi-agent. And so the way you refer to the decedent in law is in the present tense or in the present perfect. You say, if the decedent has no surviving spouse. Well, what's this has, right? The decedent is right here, right now, right? You say, if the decedent has living parents, siblings, nieces, or nephews, all of these are attested. You say the decedent leaves his house to so-and-so. You don't say the decedent left his house to so-and-so. Now, no one's deluded. No one except in a cartoon, the decedent to come walking in and say, that's not what I meant at all, right? But this creates an agent in conception that you can hold on to. It's a blend that's very useful for trying to manage over these great ranges of thought. Similarly, we all have a fabulous idea of personal identity. Dolphins have signature whistles. Dogs can recognize you after a long time. But we have an idea that there's a personal identity that stretches over time. Now, I assure you, the 59-year-old you're looking at right now is very different from the baby that came out of my mother. And there have been radical differences all along the way. But it's that disanalogy-analogy thing. You compress all the analogies to one thing, and now there's one thing in the blend, Mark Turner. And the disanalogies are compressed to change. And you're required by your culture to have a sense of who you are and what your life story is. You can give the 30-second version or the 5-minute version or the half-hour version. And if you can't give them, we declare that you're insane and we lock you up. You have this personal identity, right? That's a blend that is very common to human beings, that doesn't seem to be at that level available to other species. Thinking about, gee, if I had cute great-great-grandchildren, they would need to have a trust fund. So I better set up something so that, you know, they'll think well of me down there. The flip side of compressed blends is that you can decompress them. So all of these different people you have been are blended into one. But now you can have a conversation with yourself. You can look in the mirror, and because of something in the mirror, it reminds you of when you were 18. And the person in the mirror, the person looking at the mirror can say, you did okay. And that voice is coming from the mirror. It's the 18-year-old in the mirror who's saying that. Or can say, you really failed me, right? Either one of these kinds of things. This split and have a conversation with ourselves, we do this all the time. Again, this is analogy, disanalogy, and this makes for very funny scenes in movies. Vince Vega, in a movie called Pulp Fiction, goes into the bathroom while a drink is being made for him by his employer's girlfriend in her house. And he's looking at himself in the mirror, and he says, one drink and leave. Don't be rude, but drink your drink quickly, say goodbye, walk out the door, get in your car, and go down the road. It's a moral test of yourself, whether or not you can maintain loyalty. You can tell it's not quite going to work by the amount of backbone that he's putting into this. But here, he's not crazy. He is presently speaking to a future self in a hope of trying to persuade the future self. Now, these compressions are all over the place. This is how you persuade somebody not to overfish. You say, we are eating the food off our children's plates. Now notice, fishing is not eating. Fishing in the ocean is not taking things from your children. But in the blend, they are. They're compressed. When we overfish, we eat not only today's fish, but tomorrow's fish too. This is a fabulous compression in which you're really bad because you're eating your children's food right in front of them. You're taking it off their plate. Notice, they say food because most kids don't eat fish, although I lived in Oslo for a year where I was delighted to find out that lots of them do. If we were to walk through the amount of compression and blending you need in order to understand this thing, it's absolutely immense, and it goes on and on. But no one fails the test of understanding what this is saying, and they think it's entertaining. This is by way of saying blending is not costly. It goes on all the time. Your brain is built for blending. Compression and decompression are things. It's not like a switch you turn on. It's there all the time, and I'm going to show this to you in a couple of works of art. Art often specializes. Artists are often intuitive cognitive scientists. That is, the thing that we are least built to see is how we think. The thing that the mind is least built to explain is how it works. But artists sometimes drag things on stage that are in the backstage of cognition. And so this is a little closing example of viewpoint blends. Here, this is a nude descending a staircase. So at any one moment, you see one nude, right? But art will frequently collapse all those different times into one perceptual space. This is just what you saw in Hikam El-Garouche defeating Roger Bannister. It's just what you see in a graph of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That line that's static, that's actually a series of events over time. But they get compressed to something that you can see at one time. Ads, like there's this ad that shows Joey, Katie, and Todd, and they look about 10 years old, and they're in an operating theater with scalpels, and there's a patient on the table. You don't see the head, it's you. And they look about 10 years old, and they're all scrubbed. And it says, Joey, Katie, and Todd will be performing your bypass. Okay, now what's happening there is we're supposed to think over 20 years, you know, by the time we get to that point, these kids are going to grow up. They are going to need good education in order to do that, right? But it's easy not to think about that. In the blend, you have about 10 minutes to teach these kids all kinds of medical capacities and anesthesiology so that you survive. It compresses it to something that you can see right there. And the language also does this. Before you know it, you know, we have to care about tomorrow's good jobs and so on. All trying to compress the time scale down into something that you can see. Nobody's deluded. The last place you're going to see 10-year-olds is operating in an operating theater. But it's a very effective artistic presentation. This is all by way of showing that art sometimes gives us cognitive scientists ideas. There's a phrase, for example, it's the now plus the past tense, as in, he now saw that his project would fail. Now, there's a problem with that linguistically, because now is proximal. It means now. Past tense means not now or not here. It's distal, right? So this is a conundrum. And the analysis is, this is a viewpoint blend. For the purposes of understanding how the history is being set up and narrated, you have the perspective of the narrator. But for the experience on that particular event, you have the viewpoint of the consciousness that's being narrated. And what this little linguistic prompt asks you to do is a viewpoint blend, where you've got some of the narrative viewpoint and you've got some of the consciousness viewpoint, and you know for which parts. I now realize that the president was going to be reelected, right? You do this kind of thing instantaneously. So the minute I saw this analysis was done some years ago, I went looking into Red Hin Lab, which is an enormous archive that I run with Francis Steen. Because if this is really happening, then we ought to see signs where somebody narrates the now plus past tense, a viewpoint blend, and what we see is the camera zoom in on the consciousness that's having those experiences. And that's exactly what happens. So we try to do with an awful lot of this predictions of findings and some actual experiments. Viewpoint blends are very familiar to you, the basis of various kinds of art, where you see various different views of an individual put together, as in Picasso. But it's also very old. It goes back as far as art has been here. This is a Rohir triptych of the 7 sacraments. You're inside the church, but there's, of course, the crucifixion with the holy women, right? It's asking you to conceive of a concept of eternity and hold it all in mind. Annunciations are one of my favorite examples of this, because, of course, the Annunciation is when the angel of the Annunciation comes and says, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." You're pregnant. And notice that you can get all kinds of things in this. For one, it's compressed to human scale. I mean, the angel on the left there doesn't come in as an enormous thing and you only see the foot. No, this is 2 women in a bedroom, right? And of course, there's Mary in the kinds of robes of the contemporary. You can't see it, but Christ on his own little cross is coming on the breath of God from the window straight to Mary's womb. And what is Mary reading in most of these Annunciations? There were no books, right? But what is Mary reading? She's reading the story of the Annunciation. A cool example is this one, again, Rohir. This is the Annunciation. That medallion on the bed is the resurrection. So you get a compression here from not yet having been born to having been risen from the dead, all in one room to hold on to. This is not reserved to high art. And this is the thing I'm going to close with. Here's Harold and his purple crayon. Anything he draws is real. He wants a moon. He wants some light to go for a walk, so he draws a moon. He wants a straight path. He draws the straight path, and off he goes. In fact, at the end, he wants to get back to his room. He remembers he could see the moon from his bedroom, so he draws his bedroom window around it, and presto, changeo, ipso facto, he's back in his bedroom. Every 3-year-old understands this. It's a kind of physics of which you can have absolutely no experience, translocation by drawing. But it's a new idea. They get it immediately. They can go on with it. And it gets used all over the place, even in high art. It's a compression of the representation with the identity. And you can find it throughout children's literature. So what I want to say is thank you very much for inviting me here to talk about this strange capacity human beings have, that they run all the time to call up things that should not go together and to connect them and to project selectively from them to create a new idea that has emergent structure in the blend that is not contained in the inputs. And if you want to hear more, the book will be out January 2014. Thank you.